Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Absalom's rebellious return, 2 Samuel chapters 14 and 15. Our story so far revolved around some of the sons of David. He already had Solomon. He has other sons too that aren't going to be mentioned in the story. But Amnon, his firstborn, had lusted after his half-sister Tamar, his stepsister, and had raped her. And David had done nothing about it. And Absalom had seen it, had become angry, had concocted a plot, and then finally had murdered Amnon, and then had run away from home. Now as our story begins, chapter 14, verse 1, now Joab, the son of Zeruiah, had perceived that the king's heart was inclined toward Absalom. Absalom's been allowed to return, but he has not come into the presence of his father David. Verse 2, so Joab sent to Tekoa and brought a wise woman from there and said to her, please pretend to be a mourner and put on mourning garments now, and do not anoint yourself with oil, but be like a woman who has been mourning for the dead many days, and then go to the king and speak to him in this manner. So Joab put the words in her mouth. A plan is being concocted. Verse 4, now when the woman of Tekoa spoke to the king, she fell on her face to the ground and prostrated herself and said, help, O king. Verse 5, the king said to her, what is your trouble? And she answered, truly I am a widow, for my husband is dead. Your maidservant had 2 sons, but the 2 of them struggled together in the field, and there was no one to separate them. So one struck the other and killed him. So far, so good. Verse 7, now behold, she says, the whole family has risen against your maidservant, and they say, hand over the one who struck his brother, that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed, and destroy the heir also. And maybe there's a hint there of what's taking place. They want to take the surviving son and put him to death because, after all, he's a murderer. But notice, they're going to destroy the heir. And that's a hint that maybe, in addition to being interested in justice, maybe they are interested also in the inheritance. And she goes on to say, thus they will extinguish my coal which is left, so as to leave my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth. Verse 8, and then the king said to the woman, go to your house, and I will give orders concerning you. Verse 9, the woman of Tekoa said to the king, O my lord the king, the iniquity is on me and my father's house, but the king and his throne are guiltless. Notice she's going by way of application. Verse 10, so the king said, whoever speaks to you, let him bring him to me, and he will not touch you anymore. David hasn't seen his own story in this. All he's seen is the story that's been brought to him, and he has not seen the parallel. Verse 11, now she's going to point that out. Now, then she said, please let the king remember the Lord your God, so that the avenger of blood will not continue to destroy, otherwise they will destroy my son. And he said, as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. Then the woman said, please let your maidservant speak a word to my lord the king. And he said, speak. And now she's going to give the explanation. Verse 13, the woman said, why then have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in speaking this word, the king is as one who is guilty, in that the king does not bring back his banished one. Notice she's been talking about her surviving son, but the king has a surviving son. Verse 14, she goes on to say, for we will surely die and are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Yet God does not take away life, but plans ways so that the banished one will not be cast out from him. She's calling David to act toward his son the way he has acted toward her surviving son, her guilty son. Verse 15, now the reason I have come to speak this word to my lord the king is that the people have made me afraid. So your maidservant said, let me now speak to the king. Perhaps the king will perform the request of his maidservant, for the king will hear and deliver his maidservant from the hand of the man who would destroy both me and my son from the inheritance of God. In other words, there really is a son that she has. She says, I'm really telling the truth. Then your maidservant said, please let the word of my lord the king be comforting, for as the angel of God, so is my lord the king to discern good and evil. You made a good decision when you called that, and may the Lord your God be with you. Now, David begins to see through it. Then the king answered and said to the woman, "Please do not hide anything from me that I am about to ask you." And the woman said, "Well, let my lord the king please speak." And the king said, "Is the hand of Joab with you?" He hears a different voice coming from this woman. "Is the hand of Joab with you in all this?" And the woman replied, "As your soul lives, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or the left from anything that my lord the king has spoken. Indeed, it was your servant Joab who commanded me, and it was he who put all these words in the mouth of your maidservant. You saw through me, and it is as you say." Verse 20, "In order to change the appearance of things, your servant Joab has done this thing. But my Lord is wise, like the wisdom of the angel of God, to know all that is in the earth." You saw through it. You understood the message. You understood what was happening. Verse 21, "Then the king said to Joab, Behold now, I will surely do this thing. Go therefore, bring back the young man Absalom." And Joab fell on his face to the ground, prostrated himself, and blessed the king. And then Joab said, "Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, O my lord the king, in that the king has performed the request of his servant." David saw through it, but also David acts accordingly. Now what we have here is by way of a contrast and a comparison. You see, David, back in his story, back in chapter 11, he had murdered Uriah to hide his sin. Absalom has murdered Amnon, not to hide his sin, but out of revenge, because nothing had been done to avenge the rape of his sister Tamar. In David's story, Nathan came and told a story about an injustice, about a rich man who had killed the lamb of a poor man, and David heard that and made a decision on the basis of that story. And now a wise widow has been sent by Joab to tell a story. Her son had murdered his brother and now is to be killed. In David's story, the story brought David to a change of mind, to a repentance. And now this story also brings Absalom back home, where David changes his mind, says Absalom can now come. He can now come back home. He can come before me. Chapter 14, verse 23. "So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. However," notice there's only a partial return. "The king said, let him turn to his own house and let him not see my face." He's allowed to come back to Israel, back even perhaps to Jerusalem, but not into the presence of the king. And so Absalom turned to his own house and did not see the king's face. Notice it is a partial restoration, but it is not complete. It's a return without reconciliation. Verse 25, "Now in all Israel there was no one as handsome as Absalom, so highly praised from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. There was no defect in him. And when he cut the hair of his head, and it was at the end of every year that he cut it, for it was heavy on him, so that he cut it, he weighed the hair of his head as 200 shekels by the king's weight." He looked like a lion of a man, with a lion's mane, almost literally, upon his head. Verse 28, "Now Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem and did not see the king's face. And then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he would not come to him. So he sent again a second time, but he would not come. Therefore he said to his servant, See, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." So Absalom's servants, remember, Absalom's servants had been the one who had murdered Amnon. Now they go and they set the field of Joab on fire, and then this gets his attention. And then Joab rose and came to Absalom at his house and said to him, "Why have your servant set my field on fire?" Verse 32, "Absalom answered Joab, Behold, I sent for you, saying, Come here, that I may send you to the king, saying, Why have I come from Geshur? It would have been better for me still to be there. Why therefore, now therefore let me see the king's face, and if there's iniquity in me, let him put me to death." Verse 33, "So when Joab came to the king and told him, he called for Absalom, and thus he came to the king and prostrated himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom." And it looks like there has finally been a reconciliation, although this kiss reminds us more of the kiss of Judas. it will be a kiss of betrayal. And this begins to be seen in chapter 15 and verse 1. Now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. He is acting the part of a king. Verse 2, Absalom uses to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. Now the gate is the place where the king would sit, but he was on the way to the gate. And when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would intercept him. He would call him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, I see your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king. Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land, then every man who had any suit or cause could come to me, and I would give him justice. If only I were there instead of my father the king." Verse 5, and when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. And in this matter, Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. Verse 7, now it came about at the end of 40 years. And our problem here, the NIV has at the end of 4 years. Now the NIV is not they're not giving it a better translation. Although I think they're right. What happens is both the New American Standard and even the King James, they translate it literally the way it is in the Masoretic text at the end of 40 years. However, that when we just add up how many years that David lived and all the other events, it looks like this was a Hebrew typo. But the New American Standard and the King James said, we're not going to change it. We're going to translate it faithfully to the text. And yet the NIV said, no, that certainly was a typo. And by the way, I think they're right. And so they changed the text. And I don't really have an issue with them, although I rather like the fact that the Hebrew text wasn't changed. The Hebrew scribes who were copying the text for us, they realized, oh, there's a typo there. But we're not going to change the text. We're going to transmit it faithfully no matter what. And that's actually a good thing because it tells us how faithful they were in transmitting the text. Even though they thought, yeah, somebody made a typo here. We're going to faithfully transmit it. We're not going to change it just as we think might be the correct reading. We're going to faithfully transmit it even if maybe we're transmitting it wrong, because we're going to be faithful to the text. Well, the passage goes on to say, Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow which I have vowed to the Lord in Hebron." Now, whereas the text is faithfully transmitted, Absalom was not faithfully transmitting his desires. And so verse 7, it came about at the end of these 40 years. He says, "Let me go and pay my vow which I vowed to the Lord in Hebron, for your servant vowed a vow while I was living in Geshur in Aram, saying, if the Lord shall indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord." He's not going to serve the Lord. He's there to serve himself. Verse 9, the king said to him, "Go in peace." And so he arose and he went to Hebron. And remember, Hebron had been the traditional capital of the tribe of Judah. It's where David had originally led the tribe before Jerusalem being the new capital. Verse 10, but Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron. He's seeking to make himself king. Verse 12, and Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gileonite, David's counselor from his city Gilo, while he was offering the sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. He's conspiring to steal the throne, and he's won over to his side Ahithophel, David's chief counselor. Verse 13, then a messenger came to David, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. And David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for otherwise none of us will escape from Absalom. Go in haste, or he will overtake us quickly and bring down calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. David has to run. David has to become a fugitive. Verse 15, and the king's servants said to the king, behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king chooses. So the king went out, and all his household with him, but the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. And the king went out, and all the people with him, and they stopped at the last house. Now, we've noted already the comparison, the parallel between 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. How that 1 Samuel had both the birth of Samuel and Hannah's song about the birth, and Samuel had heard God, and there was war with the Philistines. There was the travels of the ark, and Saul had been established. And then Saul's sin had been spotlighted at his sin of sparing Agag. And we've seen the same sort of events taking place in 2 Samuel, beginning in chapter 1, where Saul had died, and again there'd been a song, there'd been listening to God, there'd been war with the Philistines, again the travels of the Ark of the Covenant, David had been established as king, and then the sin of David and Bathsheba. We saw already that David, in the same way Saul had been confronted by Samuel, David was confronted by Nathan. But now we see David as fugitive, and most of the rest of the book, for quite a few chapters, will be the extended story of David as fugitive as he goes on the run. The whole latter end of 1 Samuel had been David as fugitive. The whole latter end, not all the way to the end of the book, but close to it, will be David as a fugitive. It reminds us of how the better David, Jesus, came to earth, can I say it this way, to be a fugitive. He said, foxes have their holes, birds have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He became a fugitive for us, that we might have an eternal home.